Good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this special meeting for this Tuesday, January 19th, 2021 of the Sweetwater County Board of County Commissioners. Our primary purpose today is a budget message, and what we'll start out to do is we'll have a presentation from our assessor and our treasurer to again show us the state of finances for the county. And then the commission will let the groups know how we're going to proceed with the budget this year. Before we get moving, I would at this time let you know there's a quorum present, but I'll entertain a motion that we call this meeting to order. Commissioners?
I'd so move.
So moved by Commissioner Lloyd to bring the meeting to order. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Toman. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Okay, and commissioners, as we move into this meeting workshop, one of the things I would like to do is entertain a motion to suspend Robert's rules for this meeting, which only means that we can have a little more relaxed meeting, but we will still follow being recognized by the chair for any conversations. So I would entertain a motion to suspend Robert's rules.
So moved.
So moved by Commissioner Smith. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Commissioner Lloyd. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. So with that, first up to present for us is our treasurer, Mr. Davis, and I believe following him will be our assessor, Mr. Davis, and then followed by our treasurer, Mr. Slaughter. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for being here again this afternoon. Mr. Davis, would you go first?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I want to do is just really kind of start at the basics with the county valuation and just let everybody kind of understand where these numbers come from and what they mean. So the county valuation is what's used to actually multiply by a mill levy to generate a tax. And the assessor's function is to actually calculate that valuation. And I hope everybody can see my screen. It worked this morning. I hope I didn't lose it since the earlier commission meeting. But what we're doing here is looking at the property tax year of 2021 and the valuation estimates. Now, the biggest part of our valuation has almost always been minerals, and I have a slide to show why that might be changing later. So the way we get the mineral estimates is we get them from the Department of Revenue and specifically the Mineral Tax Division. When a producer severs a mineral from the ground, they pay severance tax to the Department of Revenue. Now, the Department of Revenue actually collects that tax monthly, and then that valuation that's used to collect that tax is what we use to actually tabulate valuation that's used for all of the budgeting that's done countywide by all the agencies. And then the Treasurer's Office actually bills that property tax in September, and those collections happen after that. The timeline for mineral valuation is a little convoluted, and that's why there has been some legislation that you may have seen over time that would adjust this billing cycle. But currently, any production that is taken out of the ground in calendar year 2020 is actually part of the valuation for the 2021 tax year. And then the bills are not actually sent from the Treasurer's Office until September of 2021. So you'll hear a phrase when they talk about legislation, you'll hear people talk about how the billing for ad valorem tax based on value is up to 18 months behind, and they're not wrong, because a mineral that is extracted from the ground in January of 2020 doesn't necessarily get a property tax bill sent until September of 2021. And that's that time delay that you see in the actual extraction of the mineral and the billing from the county. And in that time period, that's where you will see potentially bankruptcies happen. Companies just pull up and leave, leaving those outstanding liabilities, at least for the ad valorem tax side of that mineral production. Okay, here's our county valuation over time. And this is the slide I was talking about earlier. You can see our county valuation in 2015 was almost $3 billion. And of that $3 billion, the minerals that you see there in the orange column on the right, it was generated by 68% of that mineral valuation. And when I talk minerals, I'm talking natural gas, oil, Trona, underground, and surface coal are the big five. Those are the values that we're talking about. So in 2015, we were almost at $3 billion, but 68% of that was made up from those five minerals. And it was just the production of those minerals. And you can see over time how that had changed. Currently in 2021, the taxes that we will bill in the fall of 2021, if our estimates are good, the county valuation will be under 2 billion. And I bet for the first time in history, our minerals are less than half of that. This slide shows a breakdown of how the minerals are actually broken up. And, you know, we've always talked about how Sweetwater County is a boom and bust economy. We have times when things are great, and then we have times like we're in now. This chart shows that. 2015, if you look at this chart, you can see we had natural gas value of over $800 million by itself. And that's price times production, but that equation amounted to $800 million in value. You know, that's a great example of the boom, but you can see the following year, maybe not a bust, but certainly a huge drop. They went from 800 million to just under 4. So it dropped almost in half. If you see the minerals over time, you can see how the one that made me nervous this year was Trona. Okay, so in 2015, we were like $450 million in value. 2020, it was just under 5. And we're projected right now to be about 375. So that's a 25% drop in Trona. Now, the reason I always focus on Trona is because it's just a juggernaut. You can see over time, it doesn't fluctuate. It just keeps trucking along. People keep working. Trona keeps producing. But this pandemic affected that industry. I mean, Trona's always had minor effects from global economies, you know, stuff flooding the market, that kind of stuff. But it's never affected the value this much. And this is what made me very, very nervous this year. I mean, we see the oil and gas stuff go down all the time. And I think we all understand that coal may be on its way out, but the values have held pretty steady over the last little while. But the one that scared me the most was the Trona. That was the one that was a big indicator of what was going on in the county. So this slide, now I broke this up just on the general fund. So this is only the fund that the commissioners use to fund core county government. So in last year's budget, this total was $35 million in ballpark numbers. Of that 35 million, 20.5 million was property taxes. Everything else there is listed, the biggest producers, but of that pie you have, $20 million of that is property taxes. That's why the county valuation is so important. Everything else matters. All those dollars are important, but when property taxes are down, that's what affects the budgets more than anything else. And the commissioners are getting tired of hearing this, but budgets are numbers on paper. And until those producers actually pay those taxes, you don't necessarily have $20 billion. You might think you're going to, but until the money's in the bank, it doesn't really happen. So that's one thing I'm cautioning people as well. And it goes back to that delay in the billing, the production and the billing. There's 18 months there for bad things to happen to those producers. And if they go out of business before that tax is billed, getting it collected is not nearly as easy as it sounds. Okay, so this is my second to the last slide, but this is very, very indicative of what the commissioners are going through right now. Tax year 2020, our valuation was 2.3 billion. That 2.3 billion, when you multiply it by 12 mills, and again, this is the valuation that was used and the numbers that were used to fund everybody. So all the agency funds as well. So this was $28,424,000 is what that valuation generated. The estimates we're using for the valuation this year, the valuation is dropping to $1.9 billion. So the same 12 mills multiplied by that levy only generates $23,400,000. So there's a $5 million drop right off the bat from the last tax year that we billed to the current tax year that we're going to build. And that's why these budget discussions are starting sooner and everybody's very concerned. We're $5 million in the hole before we ever get started. So it just kind of spells that out a little bit. Now, as I told the commissioners earlier this morning, there is a little bit of good news. Natural gas for most of 2020 was hovering around $1.50 an MCF, which is not great. We had a little bit of a bump in September, and it actually continued through the end of December. Now, The estimates that I'm getting for value are always 3 months behind. The Department of Revenue provides that information to us, but we won't get the information through December until March. So we're basically a quarter behind on getting this information. So as soon as I get that information from the commissioners, I'll update that and we'll do this presentation again. But this is a little bit of good news, but no one should think this is going to erase the $5 million that we're in the hole. I've estimated the numbers out for these last 3 months, and I've been fairly conservative, but we'll have better numbers in March. But this is kind of the process, how the valuation calculates into this, and why everybody is so concerned at the moment. Does anybody have any questions?
Commissioners, any questions? Thank you, Dave. Go on.
Okay.
Assessor Davis,
Yes, sir.
are you finished?
Yes, sir.
All right,
Unless there's any
thank you.
questions.
Commissioners, any questions for Mr. Davis? Thank you. Right
Okay.
now, we'll welcome our treasurer, Rob Slaughter, for his presentation coming out of the treasurer's office. Mr. Slaughter, are you out there?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I am.
Thank you.
I hope that once again, technology is working for me and that you're seeing the same sheet that I had for you first earlier this morning. So what I am trying to do at this point in time is to give a little bit of context to the numbers that Mr. Davis provided in his presentation. So if you look at this spreadsheet that we have on the screen now, you can see that for the fiscal year 2021 budget, our assessed value was $2.3 billion. With the projection that Mr. Davis gave us now of $1,956,000,000, we're looking at a $411 million decrease in value. So this spreadsheet is to try and give you an indication of how much revenue will be lost under the 12 mill levy if you were to levy the same number of mills for fiscal year 22 that you did for 21. I'm not proposing that you try and cut all of the expenditures from these entities, but this is how the 12 mill levy works. And so this is going to show you, based on that levy and projecting it forward for fiscal 22, what the decreases would be under that 12 mil. So if you look at the fiscal 21 budget, we used 8.72 of the 12 mills to fund the general fund. That created $20.6 million of revenue for the general fund on the $2.3 billion in value. With Mr. Davis's new assessed valuation projection, we would be looking at $17 million in revenue created by that same 8.72 mills. So we would be looking at about $3.5 million less revenue in the general fund based on that number. If you look then, the rest of the 12 mil was aggregated between the other entities, the component units. So we had the events complex, the library, the museum, the hospital, and Southwest Counseling all receiving a portion of that 12 mil. On the 1.09 mils that was levied for fiscal 21 for the events complex, it raised $2.58 million last year. Under the projection, it would raise $2.135 million. For the library, they levied 1.19 mils. That created $2.82 million in revenue for the library. We would be looking at $2.33 million under the current valuation. So a decrease of $491 million on that. For the museum, there was a 1.137 mil levy, which created $325,000. Under the new projection, it would be $268,000, or a $56,000 decrease. Southwest Counseling's levy was 0.289 mils, which created $684,000 for them. It would be $565,000 under the new projection. And the hospital had 0.567 mils, so it created $1.3 million for them last year. Under the new projection, it would create $1.1 million. And you can see the decrease we would be looking at would be the $4.943 million that Mr. Davis was talking about. So once again, as you're looking at this budget, you're going to allocate this loss of revenue over the entire county. You're going to allocate it over the general fund, over those human service agencies that you fund for $5.9 million in the 21 budget. The grants was a portion of this, and then also the component units. But this is the amount of the decrease that we're going to see and how it will affect the actual 12 mil levy. So before we move on, my next slide will actually show our sales tax revenues over the last couple of years. Are there any questions from anyone on this before we move to that?
Commissioners, any questions? No questions. Go on, Rob.
Okay, moving on. Our next sheet shows a sales tax comparison from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 21. If you look at the last two columns, it shows our actual collections for fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21 for our optional and for our state taxes. So the first number here, the $239,000, represents the sales tax revenue received on the optional 1 cent tax in July of 2019. This is a corresponding amount that was received in July of 2020. And you can see there was a 20% decrease in the optional for that month. As you go down through each of the months, you can see the monthly decrease. And on the optional sales tax, up through this point in time, we've had $381,000 less of sales tax revenue than what we had through the same period of time in fiscal year 20. The state tax has the same thing. What we're looking at is $506,000 less in revenue. So you can see it's a 22% decrease in the optional sales tax, 21% decrease in the state sales tax. So giving you some, once again, an indication of where the sales tax revenues are and where they have been over the last few months. So any questions with respect to that?
Commissioners, any questions? None. Thank you, Rob.
Okay, the last sheet that I'll show is a comparison of the fiscal year budget 21 versus a projected budget for 22 with some of the things that we're looking at potentially funding or cutting at this point in time. If you look, the fiscal year 21 budget, we had estimated revenues of $38 million at the county level. The estimated expenditures, our core county was $37 million, grant projects were $3.4 million, and our agencies were $5.9 million. So on $38 million of revenue, we had $47 million of expenses to fund in the budget for fiscal 21. To fund that budget, the commissioners allocated $8.9 million of reserves. And that was made up of roughly $3.3 million of carryover, which came through last year's budget, and $5.5 million, which came from our actual county reserves. So if you look, our fiscal 20 cash reserve balance was $39,680,000. Our fiscal 21 cash reserve dropped to $34,128,000 with the use of that $5.5 million to fund that budget. So just in general terms, once again, not advocating, just looking at the facts, looking at what it took to fund the budget with $8.9 million last year. If we were to fund the fiscal 22 budget at the same level for all of the entities with the $4.9 million decrease, the commission would have to fund $13.845 million of reserves to balance the budget. So there have been some changes that the commission has made up to this point in time that will affect that, some things that weren't included in the fiscal 21 budget, or some things that you've cut out that won't be in the 22 budget. So this is actually showing that the $34 million would be the general fund revenue that would be created under the new mill levy. I've left our estimated expenditures at the same level. Through the voluntary separation program, the commission has saved the county about $1 million for next year, theoretically. The same program had costs incurred of $420,000 that we've got to account for. There was salary increases which were done in the last commission meeting for the IT department, and I believe some of the sheriff's department. That was $239,000 that would not have been reflected in the 21 budget, that will be reflected in 22. I've left the grant projects the same. The agencies were funded at $5.9 million in the 21 budget, but the commission has already addressed the ambulance issue and has said that they will not fund the ambulance. So the ambulance was funded in the 21 budget with $931,000. So we've taken that out. Then you would have to fund each of those entities that are component units with the amount that would have decreased from that funding. So what we would be looking at hypothetically at this point in time with the revenues that are projected, $34 million in revenue, $47 million in expenses would be where we would be at. It would take $12.5 million of reserves to fund that balance. Now, if you were to do that, the fiscal 22 cash reserve balance, if we assume the same $3.3 million of cash carryover, would decrease the reserve funds from $34 million to $24.9 million. So that's why you can see it's going to be imperative for you to certainly cut expenditures. We can't continue funding with reserves at the level that we are and believe that we're going to be able to sustain. So the commission is going to have to look, certainly cutting the budgets pretty dramatically to get back to what they believe our funding level should be for our reserves. And that was something we talked about in the commission meeting this morning. One of the first steps should be for the commissioners to determine at what level they believe the reserves should be funded. And once that's done, you can start working towards the budget, working forward to come up with how you want to address this funding decrease moving into the 22 budget. So that would be pretty much everything that I have got. If there are other questions, I would once again certainly be glad to address them. Otherwise, I will stop sharing and I will listen. So
Thank you, Treasurer Slaughter. I appreciate it. Very well done by both you and Assessor Davis. Commissioners, any questions for either one of them? Commissioner Toman.
Yes, Mr. Slaughter. So the 13 million from reserves would be assuming that we kept the same budgets, and that would be the total amount of difference, right?
that would be correct, assuming you funded everything at the same level you did 21.
Okay.
So I hope you're not suggesting let's go home. Job's done, Mary.
Thanks. I was hoping.
I know it, we all were. Okay, any other questions for either the assessor or the treasurer? Commissioners? Okay, so this brings us to why we scheduled this Zoom meeting and invited core government, elected officials, outside agencies, component units, and primarily, hopefully everybody that's on is an entity that we fund through the county, either through our, primarily through our general fund or primarily through other means. And we waited till we got third quarter numbers, and we're grateful we did, because 3 months ago, it looked like we were about 6.2 million. But now you can see it's right under 5, right at 5. We're hoping for better news in the third quarter numbers, but at least we feel we can start moving forward and talking with our funding partners as to some expectations as we move forward into our budget. And some of those things, just to provide for you as we work with you moving forward, we'll start meeting with our funding partners sooner than we have in the past. We probably will do it just a little bit differently. We're not too worried at this point in time that our accountant gets out the individual papers, start building budgets. I think before you can build the budgets, we need to sit down and figure out what it is that's going to be built in your budget. So with that in mind, the commission has talked about at the next meeting we'll talk about where we want our reserve limits. And then we'll talk a little bit further at the next meeting, meeting with our funding agencies, just to share with you. But as we plan to meet with our funding agencies, a couple of the things we want you to be thinking about and to share with you in past experiences, there's been across the board cuts, percentage, cut it, percentage, cut it. This commission has taken on a different direction of, we want to look at each budgetary agency and work with them, because we know that this is going to be the year that there's going to be cuts. For some, it'll be more than others. But we also know that when we set this precedence, we also are getting ourselves ready again for next year, because if anybody that's been in the game, everything we're hearing and seeing is that wherever we're at with revenues this year, very likely a repeat next year. So we are also looking ahead, trying to be a little visionary as we work forward. So some of the things we're going to work with you as, and I'd like to say this probably individually with a couple commissioners, some support staff from the community, to meet with you as an agency rather than bring everybody in like we have in the past. Some of the things we want to talk about is, we mainly want to talk about the dollars that we provide for you, that is funded out of our general fund and that we provide for you. Secondly, we want to know how the CARES money has impacted your budgets. In other words, in some organizations we know, and some of us are affiliated with it, by the time they work through the CARES money, they've been held harmless, they're whole. So we need to know that, and we expect to be able to have those conversations with you. We also need to have agencies be very cognizant of duplicating services. You know, if you're duplicating the services in those outside agencies or component units, you know, we need to kind of be able to figure out where they're at so we can look at them and be able to help make sure that we're operating more efficiently. And as we work forward with our agencies, we will start first with our core government. That's our department heads, departments in the county courthouse, and elected officials. Keep in mind, by statute, we have to fund mandatory obligated funding for core government, elected officials, and some of the funding that we provide to our component units. We want to look very carefully at that operation, so we're moving that way first. So following elected officials, we'll move into component units, and then we'll move into outside agencies, just to learn and to work with you on your budgets and that type of thing. So we want to take the time. We want to hear what individuals with their budgets have to say. But again, too, everybody will be faced with making some necessary revisions to their budgets. One of the things that I used in education, and I don't know as I look through the list, or maybe some people out there that were teachers of mine at the high school, is we need to build budgets based on need, not on want. In many ways, that means, do we travel out of state? Do we travel in state? Do we cut our dues and fees to organizations? So those are the things that I used to talk with my teachers about at the high school that worked for the school district and moved into when we did budgets. I see this very much the same as we move forward. So there's a quick listing of this budget message. I apologize. I think we all kind of knew where the revenue was going, but we didn't know exactly where it was at. I think our assessors provided us a very conservative estimates of where we're at, and we appreciate that. But the one thing I'd like to say is it's not going to be the year for anybody to say that we've been missed or we're not going to look at it. Everybody's going to be impacted, I believe, some way, shape, or form because of the reduced revenue. And we want to work with everyone to the very best that we possibly can. So with that, I would ask if there's any further comments that my fellow commissioners would like to say at this point in time. If you do, please identify yourself and feel free to speak.
May I, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Commissioner Smith.
I think just to elaborate a little bit more on the process, as you mentioned, We will be dividing up as twos, likely, commissioners, and visiting with each department, entity, agency, whatever it is, to go over budgets and hear your proposal, where you're at. And we just felt like this would be a little bit easier way, as opposed to giving you 15 minutes before the entire commission to kind of plead your case. That way we can discuss things perhaps a little bit more in depth as we divide and conquer. So do your best to get together the numbers you need, the budgets that you feel like you're looking at. Obviously, we don't have a number of what cuts will be, but do what you can where you can before we visit, and it'll make the process a little bit easier. And then as we visit with you individually, that will help us to come back, report, and visit amongst ourselves and have a better idea of what kind of requests are out there this year. And then, of course, we will reach a consensus as a whole group on the funding for each individual request and the budget as a whole.
Thank you, Commissioner Smith. Very well said. Appreciate it. Other commissioners?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I could say a couple things.
Commissioner Lloyd?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm really excited that we're meeting with everyone today, even though we can't see everyone live in the room. And there's just a lot of names on the screen, but the information we're not sharing is not the most positive by any means. It's concerning to us all, but we wanted to be able to be forefront and honest as soon as possible as we had our numbers to be able to share with everyone that receives the county funding to know what we were walking into. So you could start budgeting and looking at things appropriately. And this is large. I mean, when you start to look at some of those numbers in that $12 to $13 million range, that's changing. And so we look forward to working with each of you guys in very open processes. I think that's why we wanted to go to the smaller numbers, so it could be more intricate, so we can stay away from across the board cuts. But this will be a process, and we look forward to working with you during this difficult process and continuing this honest, transparent discussion that we're starting today.
Thank you, Commissioner Lloyd. Any other comments, commissioners? With that, I would, at this point in time, just encourage everyone that's on the call to reach out, and if you got any questions, make sure, especially if it's about the numbers, visit with the assessor or the treasurer. But again, diligently start beginning to look at things. Probably nothing in the next 2 weeks, but shortly after our February meeting, we may, not may or probably, we'll probably be starting to work with our core government. With that, if there's no more commissioners, I would entertain a motion for this meeting to adjourn.
So moved.
Got a motion by Commissioner Smith. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Lloyd. All those in favor signify by aye, saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion adjourned. Everybody, thank you for joining us. Please stay safe and